This is Forum. I'm Michael Krasny. We're talking with Don DeLillo in a special pre-recorded edition of the program. And before we went to that break, we were talking about names, and it prompts me to ask Don DeLillo about the name Benno Levin. I guess you took a couple of Yale presidents and married them in that name. Why? Who knows?
Not intentionally. Benno Levin is the pen name of a character in the book. And I chose the name because I thought this character would use a name that sounded very much like a European anarchist or revolutionary of the early 20th century. That's where Benno Levin comes from, and has no relation to persons living or dead.
You are reluctant to see meaning in names, and what about seeing meaning in the kind of names or categories that are often pinned on you? That is, paranoia is often a part of your work, so a lot of critics like to talk about your vision of paranoia as a writer. A lot of critics like to talk about you as a surrealist, as a postmodernist. How do you react to these kinds of categories or niches?
Paranoia comes out of the culture far more readily than it does out of my own consciousness. And when I was working on some of my early novels in the 1970s and then into the 80s, particularly with Libra, I couldn't help but note the prevalence of paranoia all around me. And it entered my work for that reason and no other reason. I don't think I'm particularly paranoid. In Libra, there is...
Which I should mention to listeners is about the Kennedy assassination. Yeah.
There is a conspiracy to assassinate the president, but this is not an aspect of paranoia. So many people believe this. And in fact, the conspiracy in the novel is quite small scale. It's almost an impromptu conspiracy involving just 2 or 3 or 4 people. It's not a master conspiracy meant to explain the world around us. It's a hard subject to avoid, or was in those particular days and years. I don't think it's quite the same now. I don't sense it around me the way I used to. One may sense it more readily on the Internet. I think at some point in the 1990s, paranoia moved to the Internet. It moved out of the culture, so to speak, and into cyberspace. But it's not as noticeable as it used to be, at least not to my perception.
You do feel, or you do hear, certainly, sense of conspiratorial and paranoia, particularly with the present Justice Department under Mr. Ashcroft, especially from dissidents and people who see themselves as subversive or opposing the government.
I'm not sure that this paranoia has the grandeur of the great old days when it seemed to seep into every government act and far beyond the government, into business and industry. And very importantly, people began to misuse the term. It became part of everyday speech. Almost every utterance seemed to contain the word paranoid or paranoia. People would use it when they were talking about minor fears. People would be paranoid about mosquito bites, that sort of thing. And so once the word began to be misused, as so many terms do in this culture, I think the institution itself began to be weakened, and I think paranoia itself began to move into the darker corners of the culture and eventually almost out altogether.
This is almost a nostalgia for the old grandeur of paranoia, or the way it used to be, huh? We're not getting deja vu with this kind of paranoia today, in other words.
It's odd that you mentioned Libra and the assassination of the president, and it's a little odd to understand first that later this year we will be commemorating the 40th anniversary of President Kennedy's assassination. And it's curious to think of the accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, who seems to me to have disappeared from the discourse almost completely. even fairly recently, into in the late 1980s and perhaps into the early 90s, he was still a very controversial subject of discussion. What was he guilty of? What was his past? What were his connections? Who was he involved with? And then it slowly faded. And I wonder if young people today are aware of Oswald at all, aside from his name itself. And I wonder if he's gone forever, as it were.
Mailer tried to resurrect him. And I guess Oliver Stone, in a different way.
Well, yes, but the movie was more than 10 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
And it wasn't about Oswald. In fact, he was quite a minor character in the film. And the film...
Well, he was made into a patsy in the film, really, yeah.
Yes, the film espoused a master conspiracy in which Oswald was guiltless, which is simply not the case. He was guilty, at least, of firing 3 shots from the window of the book depository at the motorcade.
Before you wrote Libra, you must have been, in some ways, I mean, I hesitate to use the word because it's like paranoia. It's so overused now. It's like Orwellian in its misuse. But you must have been somewhat obsessed with the Kennedy assassination.
I became obsessed, but belatedly, as a matter of fact. It happened in a curiously personal way. I discovered that somewhere in the early 1980s, I discovered that Oswald and I had lived within 3 or 4 blocks of each other in the Bronx when I was 16 years old and he was 13 years old. His mother took him from New Orleans and came to New York for a year or so. I didn't know this had been the case, and it began to occur to me that if I wanted to write about this in a fictional context, I would at least have an entrance into Oswald's mind when he was a 13-year-old, in the sense that he and I were seeing and hearing the same things, if nothing else. I mean, we had that in common. And this is what got me into the notion that I might actually attempt such a novel, something I would never have done otherwise, I don't think, because I hadn't written about historical figures. It seemed another universe to me.